Hey everybody, it's Tom Woods, November 29th, 2011. I've gotten a lot of requests to respond to this article on Salon by Gary Weis called Ron Paul's Phony Populism. The premise of the article is that Ron Paul may adopt certain populist stances, but he's not a real populist. Sure, Ron Paul was against all the bailouts, and sure, he's against the warfare state, and sure, he doesn't buy into the third-grade foreign policy propaganda that's drummed into Americans' heads by the American establishment. And sure, he doesn't think it's a good idea to take poor, vulnerable people and toss them into government cages because they committed some victimless crime. And sure, Ron Paul takes all these positions. And sure, the percentage of Americans in public life taking those positions in total amounts to about 0.0003%. But that's still not quite enough to meet the exacting standards of Salon. So let's go through this article. We read right off the bat that Ron Paul is a friend of the oligarchy. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, friendship is like a two-way street, right? You make a friend, and then you do things for that person does things for you, and you kind of like each other. But it doesn't seem to be the case between Ron Paul and the oligarchy, because they hate him, right? How much support is the oligarchy giving him? How much support are Wall Street firms giving him? I mean, you name it, media elites. I mean, how much support is he getting from these people, right? The opinion molders, the people of wealth in the country. How much support is he getting from them? Basically, what, rounded off to zero? Now, why is that? Because he wants to rock the boat, and typically when you're at the top, you don't want any boat rockers. You want the status quo. Well, he's not your candidate then. So some friendship between Ron Paul and the oligarchy, that's a doozy. Well, the article doesn't get any better than that. And let me point out that there are a lot of arguments being made in this article, one-sentence arguments. Hey, he wants to get rid of this. Hey, he wants to get rid of that. And every one of those things could be a whole video talking about this cabinet department, that cabinet department. So what I'm going to do is zip through this as fast as I possibly can. I want to keep these videos as short as I can, and I sometimes don't succeed in that. And then what I'm going to do is refer you at the end to a resource page that I've compiled with additional reading and sources corroborating what I'm saying, so that you can see that, in fact, this article is entirely without foundation. It's entirely myth-making. Basically, what goes on is that the alleged conservatives believe whatever the federal government tells them about foreign policy, and the alleged progressives believe whatever the federal government tells them about domestic policy. And Ron Paul basically says it's the same scam perpetrated by the same people, and I don't believe anything they're saying. Well, that to me is why he is a man of the people, because he refuses to fall for this third-grade myth that, oh, without our wise overlords in Washington, where would we be? We'd all be earning 10 cents an hour. Our consumer products would be exploding. We'd all be eating poison food. We wouldn't have any art or science. It's all these sorts of premises that are unquestioningly accepted by Gary Weis in this article. So obviously I can't respond to them all. I've responded to these in many videos. I don't want to keep repeating myself. But on my resource page, I'll give you all the videos and corroborating articles and book excerpts that you need to see what this guy is full of, and it's not a search for truth, put it that way. So now Ron Paul, in his budget plan, where he's going to cut $1 trillion in the first year from the U.S. budget, which is still not enough to balance the budget, but it's got everybody in the media class totally terrified. Oh my heavens, what would we do if we ever went back to the federal budget of 2006? What a disaster, right? People would be in the streets dead. We'd be stepping over corpses on our way to work if we ever went back to that austere federal government budget of 2006. So let's go through these departments. I'm going to go through only 2 of the departments, and the other 3 I'll put on the resource page. But let me read Gary Weis. No more aid to education. Goodbye, Department of Education. Come on now. Goodbye. So what? So what? The Department of Education was started in 1979 under Jimmy Carter. And when it was started, you know who was against it? Not just the terrible right-wingers who are against education because they thrive on ignorance and all whatever. It was the New York Times that was against it, the Washington Post that was against it, the American Federation of Teachers that was against it, and they were basically saying that adding one more layer of bureaucracy to the existing layers of bureaucracy is not what's needed to solve our educational problems. Well, I think it's a fairly good point made by people who aren't exactly known as being right-wing extremists. But now for Gary Weis, it's like unthinkable to be opposed to something that even the Washington Post and the New York Times were once opposed to. So Gary Weis, as usual with all these thought controllers in the media, wants to make sure that the range of options available to us is always shrinking. Like, sure, the New York Times may have allowed this 30 years ago, but you can't think that now. Well, what have the results been? I mean, do you walk around and say to yourself, boy, people are really much better educated now? That people were a bunch of doofuses in like 1971, but boy, my goodness gracious, I talked to the average 17-year-old and boy, it's just one golden insight after another. Well, no, of course not. In spite of a huge increase in the amount spent, controlling for inflation, per capita, there have been no cuts in education, obviously. The spending on education has ballooned, and the results are, well, not very impressive. You get rid of the Federal Department of Education, all you're doing is basically saying, well, people should just run their own schools in their own neighborhoods, right? The states should run it, or localities should run them, or churches, or private organizations, or parents. That's all you're saying. You're not saying there'd be no education just because you get the federal government out of it. That's all it's saying. So basically, Gary Weis ought to be honest with the public and say, I think Americans are too stupid to run their own schools, so we can't get rid of this federal agency overseeing it. He ought to be honest enough to just come right out and say that. Then we've got no more programs to promote commerce and technology. Goodbye, Department of Commerce. Is this guy serious? The Department of Commerce, as anybody who knows anything about it knows, and by the way, it's not enough knowing about a cabinet department to just know what its name is. I know it's called the Department of Commerce. That doesn't mean that all it does is facilitate commerce, and if you like commerce, you must like this department. You got to go a teensy bit beneath the surface sometimes when you're learning about things like this. The Department of Commerce may as well be called the Department of Corporate Welfare. That's basically what it is. It's all corporate welfare. What would be the opposition to getting rid of this thing? Like, why? It's just corporate welfare. And then this implication that without government sponsorship of technology, we won't have any technology is too laughable, really even to consider. And I've talked about this, and I'll put some stuff on the resource page about it. But when you look at government funding of science, the private sector was much, and I sometimes call the private sector the voluntary sector, the sector where things are done without a gun in the ribs, which is more than you can say for the government sector. In the private sector was much more generous as a percentage of GDP in funding science than governments have ever been. And I've written about why it is that these sources have begun to dwindle as government funding has expanded. But the point is that the private sector has funded it much better. And in the 19th century, when Britain was riding high as the industrial power of the world and scientific power of the world, it was spending zero on government science and technology funding, whereas France and Germany were spending enormous sums on it and were lagging very far behind. Now, what if the situation were reversed? What if Britain was spending an enormous amount and they were doing really well? France and Germany were spending nothing and were lagging behind. Well, Gary Weis would say, hey, you stupid Neanderthals, don't you see we need government funding of these things? But when exactly the opposite is the case, as it almost always is with these government myths, like we wouldn't be able to survive technologically without the government, when the exact opposite is the case, what do we hear? Crickets, right? Gary Weis doesn't even mention, he probably doesn't even know about it. It wouldn't surprise me at all. Then we hear about Ron Paul's opposition to the very existence of the Federal Reserve. We don't get any arguments in favor of the Federal Reserve from Gary Weis, the implication being that, of course, all reasonable people support the Federal Reserve. Well, it's interesting to see a progressive like Weis come right out and support the most reactionary institution in American life, the Federal Reserve, which stands ready to backstop the most influential and wealthy individuals and institutions in the country. And that's what it does, as not just as a lender of last resort and the bailouter of last resort, but in the whole cartel structure of the American banking system. That's exactly what it is. The Federal Reserve presides over a structure that has nothing whatsoever to do with the free market. The American banking sector is about as far removed from the free market as you can get, short of outright nationalization. So we're supposed to be in favor of the Fed, I presume, because he doesn't deign to give us an argument. We're supposed to be in favor of the Fed, presumably because the Fed has given us economic stability. And it has given us fewer and shallower recessions. And before we had the Fed, we had all these ups and downs, and thankfully we don't have that anymore. Well, again, look at my resource page. You look at the real statistics, not the phony baloney ones that were being used 20 years ago, but the ones that real scholars, including Christina Romer, by the way, who was in the Obama administration, so it's not just, my friends, it's everybody recognizing this. You look at the real numbers, these claims the Fed makes for itself are not even true. It's not true that we've had more stability or fewer or shallower recessions. The extent of the recessions before the Fed were exaggerated by the previous statistics, and after the Fed were understated. So when you look at it overall, the Fed has not improved things. It has given us the this housing bubble that we're still recovering from the crash of. It gave us the Great Depression. And moreover, what's it done for the average person? What's it done? Has it made his life better? No, the average person can't save for the future. Because if you just pile up green pieces of paper issued by the Federal Reserve and then expect to retire on that, they're not going to be worth anything by the time you retire. Before the Fed, you used to be able to do that. But now, if you want to retire, you've got to be a Wall Street speculator. You've got to take your green pieces of paper and just go into the markets and hope that somehow you can hold on to the value of your nest egg, the purchasing power of your nest egg. You've got to hope for that. Well, gee, thanks a whole lot, Gary Weis. Your overlords are really super. But I've got a whole lecture where I talk about the real situation, what was really going on in those economic cycles and panics before the Fed over at my resource page. Stay tuned to the end. We'll give you that. Then we get this discussion of Sarbanes-Oxley and DoddFrank and the Securities and Exchange Commission. So let's go through that as quickly as possible. Weis says that Paul would not reform the abysmally flawed and underfunded Securities and Exchange Commission. He would eliminate it. Well, I love how he says it's underfunded, right? For every progressive, everything's underfunded. And if you just spend a few more bucks, it'd solve all your problems. But that's in fact not the case. Funding for the Securities and Exchange Commission ballooned, as did all other spending under George W. Bush, as did the staffing for the Securities and Exchange Commission. In terms of overall federal financial regulation, spending on that has tripled in real terms, adjusting for inflation, since 1980. We've got 115 institutions involved in financial regulation, so you'll count me a skeptic if I think that it's unlikely that if we'd had 116, we wouldn't have had this problem. When the Federal Reserve intervenes in the free market and pushes interest rates lower than the market wants to set them, you're going to wind up, and then there are all these other federal programs pushing that money into housing, you're going to wind up with a housing bubble. And once you've done that, there's no way to regulate your way out of it, right? The horse has left the stable at that point. The train is not in the station anymore. It's a little bit too late for regulation, particularly when you consider who are these regulators? Are they supermen? Are they a separate race of human being who wear capes and they've got on their shirt a big letter R and they have insights that you and I don't have? No, I mean, let's treat them realistically. These people in whom we are supposed to repose our trust are basically just time-serving drones. And most of them, 99.9% of them, didn't see this crisis coming. So you give them all the powers in the world, they wouldn't have known what to do with them. They don't even see the crisis coming. They're basically just very conventional thinkers. The Fed's own economists told us that the fundamentals of the economy and the housing market were sound. The Fed chairman told us this. The people we're supposed to trust. All the regulators in the world didn't even see this coming. So don't tell me, oh, we need more of them, or we need this rule or that rule that we decide after the fact might be helpful. It doesn't matter if you're going to regulate mortgage-backed securities if you don't know there's a problem with the housing market in the first place. And then moreover, you look at the regulations they did impose. Why is everybody in AAA-rated mortgage-backed securities? Because you only have to hold $2 in capital as a financial institution against them. So in other words, the regulations themselves encouraged these institutions to crowd into this particular asset class. So that when that asset class collapsed, well, what in fact wound up happening? It was all the worse than it would otherwise have been if institutions had made their bets across a variety of asset classes. So there's all that, and there's again, I'm going to include stuff about why it's ridiculously naive to think more regulation would have solved this problem. The big problems we saw leading up to the housing bubble were not things that the banks were suddenly freed to do from deregulation, and then it caused all these problems. The banks made bad loans. They were always allowed to securitize mortgages. They were always allowed to do no-doc mortgages. All these things were always allowed. So this is a myth that is intended to make us think that if we have freedom, we're just going to do stupid things with it and the economy will collapse and we need to give more power to our wise overlords. This is ridiculously naive. And as I say, I'll give you more information about that. Sarbanes-Oxley, which was passed in the wake of the Enron scandal. Well, what did this contribute? Sarbanes-Oxley basically did a few things that wouldn't have prevented the Enron scandal in the first place. Would not have prevented that scandal. It said that corporate boards, audit committees, have to be staffed by independent directors who have no history with the company. Okay, well, Enron had an 86% independent board already, and according to Chief Executive magazine, they were one of the top 5 in the whole country. And then in terms of corporate independence, these boards' independence, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway got a D in independence at a time when the atrociously run Fannie Mae was getting an A. When you look at Enron and WorldCom, it was investors that uncovered the problems long before any regulators did. The WorldCom stock plummeted below $1 a share before their accounting scandal hit. Enron's had plummeted by 61% by the time we found out about its story. The Wall Street Journal in 2006 reported that over the past 4 years, of the 700 prosecutions of corporate offenses, 0 prosecutions had resulted thanks to Sarbanes-Oxley. Meanwhile, the cost of being a public firm in the United States has more than tripled, and the number of public offerings that are executed on U.S. exchanges has plummeted from 48% in the 1990s to 8% in 2006. So this is a myth, right? This Sarbanes-Oxley thing, which we're supposed to believe is going to save us and solve our problems. And then we're told in this article that DoddFrank, the most recent financial reform bill, this is great and you can't possibly be against that. Again, we're dealing with incredible naivete. The progressives basically believe what they were taught in 4th grade, that government is composed of wise public servants who are elected to bring about the public good. Well, in fact, what winds up happening again and again and again is that the big players learn how to game the system, including the regulatory bodies. I mean, look at DoddFrank, for heaven's sake, 2,300 pages, and it's filled with over 100 references to the agency shall determine, all these open-ended statements, where obviously the big players are going to be able to determine what the actual consequences of these provisions are. In other words, who do you think is going to get access to these agencies in Dodd-Frank? Is it going to be Joe's Country Bank? I mean, just look at the access that the major players have to these regulators. It's unbelievable. So they're obviously going to game this in their favor. It's very hard to know exactly what this act is going to do, but it's got bad news and lobbyists written all over it. I mean, already by November 2010, there had already been 510 meetings with financial industry lobbyists over this act. I mean, really? To say that we just need a little bit more of this and then this time it won't go wrong, this is just absurdly naive. So what you instead need is a genuine market where people don't feel like if the SEC says this investment is okay, then it must be okay. No, there is no substitute for doing your own due diligence. Look at the SEC. It had the Bernie Madoff scandal handed to it on a silver platter for 10 years and didn't follow up on it because it was underfunded. No, as we now know, the people at the SEC were watching pornography instead of actually doing their jobs. Was anybody fired at the SEC, as far as you know? Is the SEC in any danger of not existing anymore? Of course not. No, what you need is what we have that assures the safety of American electrical products. Underwriters Laboratories is a private organization that certifies the UL symbol on your boxes, indicates that they've looked at the product and they'll attest that it's safe. And if it's not safe, their reputation is destroyed and they're finished. Well, the same thing would go with private label regulatory institutions, because anybody that wants to sell stock to the public, that basically wants to say to the public, look, we need capital, we want you to invest in us, has to be able to assure them of probity somehow. And right now they're able to rest on their laurels and saying, well, the SEC hasn't thrown us in jail. Well, sorry, obviously we need something a little bit more robust than that. And just simply saying we need more funding for the SEC is really quite pathetic. Then we get to the welfare state. Now, this is very difficult, again, to talk about the whole welfare state in 3 minutes of a video. But the argument here that's being made is that Ron Paul is a terrible guy because he thinks the welfare state needs to be cut. Well, his argument has been, I want to prioritize things. I think, obviously, the U.S. government's foreign presence should be cut first. Well, hooray. I think we can all agree on that. And then later we figure out what to do about these other things where people have grown to become dependent on them. Well, here's what Gary Weis says, that Ron Paul believes that Medicaid itself is wrong, that it should not exist because it is not the function of society to provide health care for the poor. Now, that's just a lie. That's a lie. Of course, he'll never apologize. Nobody ever apologizes. But that's a lie. When has Ron Paul said it's not the function of society to provide medical care for the poor? He may say it's not the function of government, But since when do we believe this incredibly reactionary idea that government and society are the same thing? It's funny how readily progressives fall into the most reactionary errors, whether it's supporting the Federal Reserve or supporting something like this, and arguing that government and state are the same thing. They're not the same thing. Look at how Ron Paul ran his own medical practice, as NPR reported not too long ago. His rule was, if you're poor, we will care for you for free. That is what we do, because that's what people in a free society do. Now, why are we not doing more of that? Why aren't doctors doing more of that, lawyers doing more of that? Why aren't you and I volunteering more? It's because we all feel like somebody else is doing it for us. But if somebody else wasn't doing it, we would do it. That's what society is. It's not put a gun in somebody's ribs and then transfer the money. The poor generally don't win out, ultimately, in those competitions. They get a few crumbs. But the bigwigs usually win out on that. Moreover, how much does it cost to get $1 of aid to the poor? It costs $5 because, number one, because of the deadweight losses associated with tax collection, and number two, because of all the bureaucracy that eats up the money. At some levels of government, 70% of welfare money is eaten up in bureaucracy. So we have all those problems. Then we look at how has poverty actually been conquered in the United States. The poverty rate in the year 1900 was about 95%. By the late 60s, which was when the Great Society programs actually started to get significant funding, it leveled off between 12 and 14%, and it's pretty much stagnated there ever since. So before there were any serious anti-poverty programs even worth speaking of at the federal level, we saw poverty fall dramatically, and we've seen this replicated all over the world. Now, what if it had been reversed? Okay, what if in 1900 the poverty rate was 95%, we had all this government money thrown at poverty, and poverty fell to 12 to 14%, and then we cut off the government money, we were selfish and we hated the poor or whatever, and then poverty stagnated. Well, what would the story be? What would we be hearing constantly, night and day? Well, if you're going to make strides against poverty, you obviously need government spending, because look at how far down it came with that government spending. But when the opposite is true, what do we hear? Crickets. We hear no acknowledgement when poverty was reduced so dramatically just through the normal operation of the free market. Now, I myself have observed through friends and family how the welfare state, everything that's said against it is absolutely true. That it encourages the most dysfunctional behavior. It makes it impossible for people to break out of it, to take that first step on the job ladder for a variety of reasons. But it is in no way inhumane for Ron Paul to think that there's another way for us to live as human beings, a more humane way. Instead of us sticking guns in everybody's ribs, why don't we help each other like civilized people, instead of acting like thugs in a civil war of one interest group against the other? And the fact is, the unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare are greater than twice the GDP of the entire world. Obviously, something is going to have to be cut back, and we as civilized human beings are going to have to step up and say, I am going to help fix the wreckage that was caused by government getting people into this terrible trap in the first place. So then finally we've got, so yes, he opposed the Wall Street bailouts, and that is also yay-worthy to many people. So yeah, sure, yeah, sort of like a throwaway line, sure. As if that's just like an easy thing. Sure, he was against the bailouts. How many people were consistently against the bailouts? Hardly anybody. I mean, that's a huge point in Ron Paul's favor. Well, to make a long story short here, Ron Paul is against a whole lot of things the government is doing because he believes in the people. He believes that you and I can solve our problems. If we're concerned about a problem, if we're concerned enough to vote for some schmo to loot us and then skim 70% off and then do whatever he wants with the money, then we're also good enough to just handle the problem ourselves. And that's ultimately the lesson of Ron Paul. Andrew Jackson had as his slogan, equal rights. And what he meant by that was not that I'm going to loot some people and give to others. He meant nobody gets any special privilege that's brought about through government violence. That was what he meant by equal rights. And that's why in his day he was considered a man of the people. That's who Ron Paul is. He doesn't believe the propaganda of the people in Washington that we would all be helpless boobs without them. That is a terrible libel on the human race that progressives have bought into. There is no evidence for it. It's philosophically despicable. And Ron Paul is the great champion of those of us who reject it and who embrace the idea of freedom. Now, for more information about the ideas that I've talked about here and to corroborate the things I've said, please head over to tomwoods.com/salon, and you'll see links and videos and things that elaborate on the points that I've had to make in brief and in great haste in this video. Thanks for listening.